Bom, agora nós vamos falar um pouquinho sobre o debate mundial sobre as responsabilidades dos acionistas. Para fazer a apresentação, eu gostaria de convidar agora a Presidente Executiva Interina da Rede Internacional de Governança Corporativa, ICGN, senhora Kerrie Warren. Por favor. E é claro, o senhor Mauro Cunha vai acompanhar a apresentação.
I'm mic'd up. It's a present for you. Sorry, I can't understand Portuguese. I didn't know whether you were going to say anything then. Well, listen, what an amazing day. Seriously, I have learned so much. It's just amazing to see the progressive corporate governance reforms that are really taking place in Brazil. You know, speaking to João, hearing about the takeover panel, speaking to Marco at Previ and seeing his corporate governance code, speaking to Luciana at CVM. So there's a lot to be proud of in Brazil, and I've learned a lot, and we're going to be taking it back to the global governance community. But most of all, I have to say, your reputation, Mauro, as the global enforcer of minority shareholder rights, really, today is a testament to that, because it's been an excellent day, so congratulations to you. It's also really great to be with friends. You may know that one of our board directors is Eloisa Badix from the IBGC, and prior to that was the wonderful Sandra, who's unfortunately had to leave us. So we do have a lot of friends in Brazil. We were here last year, so thank you for inviting me here today. For those of you who don't know who the ICGN is, we've been around for 20 years. We were set up by some of the world's most progressive funds, including CalPERS in the States, Hermes in the UK, some of the Aussie super funds. And we were set up to create a vehicle for the exchange of good practice between global investors. And today we represent investors with AUM of around 18 to 20 trillion dollars. And we're not just focused on investor issues. We are a broad church. Around 50% of our membership is investors, but we do represent and include conversations with many of the world's biggest corporations. And you might ask what the significance of this is. Well, if you think about 20 years ago, when Sir Adrian started his work defining corporate governance as the system by which companies are directed and controlled, directed by the board and controlled by owners. So you need both constituents to have the dialogue around corporate governance and to improve it. When Sir Adrian began his seminal work in developing the framework we all now know to be corporate governance, it really did spark a worldwide drive for international standards in corporate governance. We've been focusing over the last 20 years on anything to do with board effectiveness, anything to do with leadership, board committees, independence, remuneration. 5 years and 1 month ago, we all witnessed Lehman's, and I can tell you the pendulum has firmly swung away from the corporate community and to you guys as owners of companies. I kind of spend my life traveling the world representing investors, responding to criticisms from Europe, for example. The corporate governance framework is built on the assumption that shareholders engage with companies and hold them to account. However, the majority of shareholders are passive and often only focused on short-term profits. From Japan, and I'm picking on them because we're there in March, to be blunt, shareholders in general do not have the ability to run a company. You are fickle, you are irresponsible, and you do greedily demand high dividend payments. So 2 years ago, we were in Paris, and the famous Bob Monks came. We all know Bob Monks. He was a pioneer in corporate governance, and he's a very thoughtful, pragmatic guy, but he doesn't mince his words. And he issued a call to order to the ICGN and to investors, and he said that he said that globalization has increased the problems of effectively holding corporations to account. In the absence of international laws and regulations, the only effective enforcer of corporate governance is the owners. Owners, like corporations themselves, have global interests and are not limited by national boundaries. How do you respond to Bob's call to order? How do you prove that not all shareholders are passive, apathetic, irresponsible? Well, My glamorous assistant will now hold up our shareholder responsibilities guidance, which I hope you've all got a copy in front of you. We published this piece of work in June, and it's fairly unique in that you may have heard that around the world there are stewardship codes appearing. There's around half a dozen at the moment. And so our code, actually it's been in play for around 10 years now, we've just revised it. But what's unique about that document that you have in front of you is it doesn't just focus on the obvious external responsibilities of investors. It actually digs down into the internal governance arrangements of investors, looking at remuneration, looking at the independence of your own funds. So I'd like to just skip through some of the commandments in that, I'd like to call it the 10 commandments in that document, and perhaps we can have some questions about it if time permits afterwards. So the first commandment is recognize. Recognize your fiduciary responsibilities. This was summed up quite nicely recently by John Kay in the UK when he was doing research into long-termism in equity markets and the role of investors. And he said, fiduciary standards require that the client's interests are put first, that conflicts of interest should be avoided, and that the direct and indirect costs of services provided should be reasonable and disclosed. I think that's fairly straightforward. You are responsible for delivering value for the benefit of your clients. This includes safeguarding your investments by monitoring companies and entering into dialogue with them. As pension funds and investment managers, you are given other people's money to manage because, frankly, you're supposed to have the expertise and structures in place to do so. Failures in fiduciary duty can lie at the root of problems in governance, and conflicts of interest may sway decisions in ways contrary to beneficiary needs. The key here is for investors to understand, minimize, and manage conflicts of interest and disclose them accordingly. Govern. Make sure that your own houses are in order. You should be led by governing bodies that act independently and without bias. You should be transparent about your governance arrangements and appointment procedures for your governing bodies. Talk to your beneficiaries, understand their needs, and communicate this to portfolio managers and other agents. Value. Remuneration plays a crucial role in establishing and maintaining the culture of an organization. This means you should consider the appropriate balance between base pay and incentives, performance indicators, and time horizons. Isn't it about time we kind of stopped, continue, please do continue to engage with companies on executive remuneration, but I can tell you the lens is firmly on asset manager incentives in Europe, and it's coming your way. The fourth commandment is learn. You might be overworked and under-resourced, but it's imperative that you have the appropriate capacity and skills to be able to monitor your investee companies. This means not only focusing on your traditional aspects of corporate governance, it's actually meaning looking at the long-term health of companies, picking up on environmental and social aspects of the business. In Europe, in fact, this is the flavor of the day in Europe. There is legislation coming into play in Europe fairly soon to require companies to disclose around their environmental aspects of the business. The deal is, if companies are being requested to disclose this information, investors are required to value it. And in fact, for the last 2 years, we've been working with the European Commission on a project to, we've delivered a training program, actually. We've developed the first training program for investors on how to really get to grips with understanding what it means to be a responsible owner, what it means to be able to identify, analyze, and integrate environmental and social aspects into your corporate valuations. We've done 7 courses in 7 different jurisdictions, and we're going to have our first examination in June to become a global governance professional, I think is what we're calling it, but learn. Clarify. Adopt and disclose clearly stated, understandable, and consistent policies to guide your approaches to key issues within your investment universe. This is what the stewardship codes are all about. So the UK code was launched in 2010 in response to, it was the government's response to the financial crisis. And it was saying, you know what, we need to just have investors place on the record that they are responsible and they do have policies to manage conflicts of interest and so on. So the FRC have the auspices of overseeing the code in the UK, and it has teeth. As I said before, in fact, the responsibilities of investors has been enshrined way back in the day. Back into '92 with Adrian's first code, there was a section E just on investor responsibilities. But in fact, these days, it does have teeth. In Tokyo in March, when we go there, the FSA in Tokyo are developing their own code of stewardship for investors. It's proliferating. South Africa, the Netherlands, China was on the phone to me the other day. They're setting up their own national investor code. Number 6 is monitor. Monitoring companies is a prerequisite for responsible ownership. It will help you ensure you have an understanding of a company's individual circumstances, leadership, performance, and long-term potential. It also provides a framework for engagement and a trigger point if intervention is really needed. You might know that a number of European funds have actually divested from Walmart recently. Walmart being, I think, the world's 9th largest economy. And in speaking to APG, they had engaged and monitored this company for 2 years and really focused on this issue that they had with US practices on labor conditions. So they divested. Well, 2 weeks ago, the AP funds in Sweden divested. And 2 weeks prior to that, PGGM divested. So actually, there is a point with companies that if you're engaging with them and there is no traction, there is no improvement, well, there is an action you can take, and some of the European funds are actually making that point. Engage. The onus is on you to proactively engage with companies, and not just when there is an issue. Ongoing dialogue with companies can really help to resolve sticking points, even before they arise. And I don't mean daily conversations, clearly that's impractical, but build a relationship with general counsel or the key governance officer in the company. Just have that point of contact. Having clear guidelines on when and how you will escalate your engagement activities, this really will help companies to ensure that they understand the steps that you're going to take if they don't listen to your first concerns. Tell them what step 1 is. Step 1 is meet with management. Step 2, you'll meet with the chairman. Step 3, you'll have a media campaign. But articulate that. Vote. Voting is a key investor right, and it is your asset. It's not an end in itself, and frankly, if you're attending an AGM and you're voting no, then engagement has clearly failed. And I was in Cape Town a couple of weeks ago and speaking with the CEO of the Public Investment Corporation, which is the asset manager of GEPF, the Government Employees Pension Fund, which own 12% of the market, 30% of employment in South Africa. They're huge. And Elias and I were talking about voting, and he said that when PIC vote, they don't do it to win, they do it to send a signal. They recognize that half the time when they go to AGM, they're not going to sway the vote. They haven't got a hope in hell of swaying the vote. But the point is, they have a position, and they make that position clear even before the vote is cast to the company and externally to all of their beneficiaries and other stakeholders. Of course, voting cross-border isn't always straightforward. It's riddled with complexities. The European Parliament has actually, through the Shareholder Rights Directive, really gone some way to improve the situation in Europe. But there's still an awful lot of work to do, and the ICGN will be is looking right now at the intermediaries along the chain of investment and how we can have more responsibility and accountability clarified along that chain. Number 9 is collaborate. Investors are increasingly encouraged to act collectively with other investors where appropriate, and therefore it's helpful for you to disclose when you might collaborate and when you think it might be appropriate to collaborate. Again, this is like lifting words from the Stewardship Code. The collaboration of investors on a global scale really does pack a punch when you think that 1 in 5 shares listed on many US and European exchanges are in the hands of overseas investors. And I think speaking to friends here, I mean, it's 1/3 of investors are foreign investors in Brazil. So collaborate. And in fact, you're a great example of this. 16 investors collaborated overseas to help with your appointment to Petrobras, US, UK. Finally, influence. With the power you have, you can bring influence. In Europe, the proportion of equity managed by institutional investors has risen from around 7% in the 50s to 70% today. This significant concentration of power in the hands of institutional investors compels responsibility. But how do we harness it in a cohesive, effective way? Use bodies like the ICGN, like the PRI, like AMIC. In 2008, by way of example, we went to Delaware because we have a real issue with the lack of shareholder rights in the United States and shareholders not able to appoint or dismiss directors. So we were hosted by the Chancery Court of Delaware, and soon after that, Pfizer instigated a board resignation policy which was fairly groundbreaking at the time. And that meant that board directors were appointed on the basis of a majority vote. And since then, I think there's, well, around 80% of the S&P 500 now have a majority voting policy in place. So it's a good example of how actually collectively you can make a difference. Another example is that Russia is currently looking for accession to the OECD. They have successfully applied and been accepted by the World Trade Organization. So the Moscow Exchange is looking at how to improve its corporate governance, and clearly the Code of Corporate Governance is the first port of call. So investors, around $5 trillion of AUM, responded to this consultation. It's a great opportunity to get engaged at a regulatory level. In summary, the world is watching you. New groups are emerging that now gauge investors on how accountable and transparent they are. Ceres, for example, in the United States, regularly scans mutual funds for the way they vote on climate change. Fiduciary audits, which examine how well pension plans are fulfilling their obligations, are starting to appear in the US. And the UK Stewardship Code calls for assurance by auditors of signatory reports. The rise in social media has enabled savers as never before to probe, compare, and hold you to account as agents who manage their money. And then there's the PRI, with 1,200 signatories with $30 trillion under management. Their focus is on encouraging more consideration about integrating E and S and G into investment decision-making. For our part, the ICGN will continue to influence public policy, connect like-minded people, educate investors on their responsibilities, and foster meaningful dialogue between all market participants. I think it's time to accept Bob's challenge, to recognize your responsibilities, monitor, engage, and interrogate your investee companies. And not just on governance, but on the environmental and social aspects too. Work together to strengthen your position and use your voice to influence regulators and standard setters in their work to advance efficient markets. This is a goal we all share. I want to leave you with a philosophical note from Jean-Baptiste from the 16th century, who said, "It's not only for what we do that we are held responsible, but also for what we don't do." Thanks, everyone.
Kerrie, I must say that your speech was at least as inspiring as Bob's. And to our audience and to the realities that we live in Brazil, there's certainly a lot to think of from what you said. And I'm very happy that we have this on tape, and it's going to be in our channel on YouTube. And I really hope to use this speech in conversations we have with not only our members, but other investors, to try to build on the engagement and activism that we already have. I'm going to make a few questions and open from the floor as well. We are late, and in respect to that, I'm going to try to be brief. Vocês podem ficar à vontade de se dirigir ao pódio, fazer qualquer pergunta ou consideração para Kerrie, enquanto eu faço também algumas perguntas. And a few things crossed my mind when you were speaking, and certainly the statement of principles is something that I really hope gains readership in Brazil after your speech. There's a lot there that we must think about. But you said something interesting about codes having teeth, at least in the UK experience. We have a problem with this in Brazil, and we find it hard for soft law to really have teeth. Do you have ideas on how exactly this can be done, especially in a formal country like Brazil? Any thoughts?
Well, I did have an interesting conversation with Luciana at CVM, and I brought to her attention that Japan and China are introducing stewardship codes. South Africa has got a stewardship code. If you think about it, if you think about the world movement in governments at the late 90s, 98 was when the OECD principles were published, and then we saw a very consistent rollout of corporate governance globally, and it went like this. There was a ROSC report issued by the World Bank. The ROSC report valued the corporate governance of the country in respect to the OECD principles. It would recommend, one, that a code was implemented, a corporate governance code, two, that there was a National Institute of Directors, the IBGC, or Corporate Governance Association, and three, director training. What we're seeing now, and I'm absolutely certain of it, is that we're going to have a rollout now of national investor codes, investor training, and hopefully more and more investor bodies. So I do think that the stewardship code is going to proliferate, is going to continue to have teeth. And actually, I mean, this is something that AMEC would be most appropriate perhaps to encourage.
It's going to be my next question. You think AMEC should do this?
Absolutely. And you guys have got to write it. You know, all of the work of the ICGN, everything we do is market-led. And because of that, we're often referenced by the European Commission. We produced some fabulous work on looking at model contractual terms between asset owners and asset managers in 2011 called the Model Mandate, and that had a lot of traction with the OECD and the European Commission. People want to hear from investors.
You mentioned investor associations all over the world. Tell us a little bit about the global network of investor association and what can be expected of that.
You mean the day you and I had a drink and said, wouldn't it be great if we set up a global network of investor associations? So we, as I said, represent around 20 trillion. And then it occurred to Mauro and I that, because Mauro was saying, look, Kerrie, I'm in Europe, I want to connect with the national investor body in the Netherlands, who is it? And I was like, wow, you don't know REITs? And anyway, there's about a dozen national investor bodies, all of whom are ICGN members. So Mauro and I set up the Global Network of Investor Associations, and we launched it in June in New York. And even from that first meeting, so what happened was CII, the Council for Institutional Investors, said, geez, I really need some help on majority voting. I'm lobbying the NYSE and NASDAQ. If you guys could all send in a letter too, that would be really powerful. And so we did. And then what did you do with REITs? You did something?
We supported their petition at the IASP concerning proportional consolidation. And interestingly, by the way, the CII is now working on revised proxy cards, which has to do with a lot of what we saw today. So there's lots more coming from this collaboration. What else do you think can be done in terms of cross-border voting and ADRs? Is this something the ICGN can help with?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, this is just a decades-old problem, and ICGN we're a bit fed up with it all, and we thought, you know what, post John Kay review, where there was sort of very, very damning statements made about the industry itself in terms of the number of intermediaries in the chain and what they're all doing. And so we thought, well, actually, all of these people play a very important role, and actually we do need to engage with everybody to clarify their responsibilities and to show how they are accountable to the next person in the chain. So there are things, that's what we're doing at the ICGN, just clarifying the responsibilities at this stage.
And I have one last question, and I think people are really tired of it, people at the podium, so. And it's a slightly different topic, but in New York, we saw Sandra Guerra proposing a dialogue on the communication between boards and shareholders. So what's going on there globally?
Well, quite a lot, actually. Sandra challenged me in Rio last year, where we held our annual conference, and she said, Kerrie, when you're in Rio, I really want to invite some of the major corporates to come and take advantage of the fact that you've got the world's biggest global investors in one room at one time. Surely that's like the perfect IR opportunity. Let's get some big corporates to talk about some issues. And so we did. We had BR Foods and Ecoredivias and Vale and Inverpar and a few others, Pirelli. And actually it's turned, and we're doing it every year now. In Tokyo, we're doing it with Mitsubishi. We have the chairman of Mitsubishi coming, CFO of Sony, because people get that where you have a congregation, and we're the only place that does it. PRI do it, but they're focused on the environmental and social stuff. The ICGN is unique in that we convene you guys, but on a collective global scale. And so in terms of engagement on your behalf, it's cost efficient. And actually, it creates more alignment in your questions to the companies. And then for companies, well, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really. They enjoy engaging with you in a very efficient place with multiple investors from all over the world. So that's happening all over. Well, Previ did it. The stock exchange do it regularly. So there is much more engagement with companies leveraged by organizations like ourselves.
Excellent. Kerrie, I'm going to finish my questions here. I'm going to thank you so much for coming down here on such short notice and helping us so much in constructing this dialogue. I'd be tempted to summarize the whole event and the learning opportunities we had, including your speech, but I'm not going to do this. So what I'm going to do now is just thank you and ask Renata to come up to close the event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Muito obrigada ao senhor Mauro Cunha e também à senhora Kerrie Warren. Em nome da MEC, nós gostaríamos de agradecer a participação dos nossos palestrantes, dos nossos debatedores e também a participação da plateia. Vocês tornaram o nosso evento, cujo formato é único, realmente interativo e as discussões foram muito melhores com a participação de todos vocês. Nos próximos dias, os senhores receberão por e-mail um link para acessar a ficha de avaliação do nosso evento. Lembramos que o preenchimento dessa ficha é muito importante para que nós possamos aprimorar cada vez mais as nossas edições, como nós fizemos nessa e como continuaremos inovando sempre. Mauro, muito obrigada mais uma vez pelo convite em participar pela segunda vez aqui do nosso seminário. Obrigada a todos e tenham uma ótima noite.